In fact, I used it very intensively for about 10 years. All these shredded branches, these composts, and these BRF. And obviously, I was told it wouldn't work, that it wasn't possible, because if it were that simple, it would have already been done. And one of the first problems, like how to say, that was pointed out to me was that if I used a lot of shredded branches to replenish my soil, in fact, I would be in a permanent nitrogen deficit. It was going to cost me a fortune in nitrogen. Because when you do the little calculations you show, it seems that when you put shredded branches into the soil, it actually wants to absorb a lot of nitrogen to create inextricable matter. However, I didn't have the money to buy nitrogen, and so what did I do? I put in the shredded material, and I said to Conrad, in your opinion, will it work, will it not work? He told me it will work. Well, and everything they tell you is nonsense. Try it. So for 10 years, I did a lot of soil revitalization with shredded branches, and it turned out that I never had any, well, I had some minor nitrogen issues because we had nitrogen shortages, but very quickly, and that's when we understood the role of earthworms. We started to have a lot of nitrogen, too much nitrogen, meaning that I will show you later, basically. Throughout the entire farm, we have residuals constantly at 200 units. That is to say, enough to grow good wheat at 150 quintals, even though I never add nitrogen to my system. So we found it a bit strange, especially since everyone was telling us it wouldn't work. And in fact, it worked much better than we imagined. And that's where the work of Emily Haslip, which I briefly mentioned yesterday, was very useful because she had already done it over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and it worked. In fact, we just realized that there were little creatures called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which had been quite poorly studied, quite little studied, for a very simple reason, which is that a nitrogen-fixing bacteria eats. And what does it eat? The carbon. And so, when we are in traditional agricultural systems where the carbon cycle is extremely low, we have very few nitrogen-fixing bacteria because they simply have nothing to eat, like earthworms. And so, we cannot have fixation. I started from this dead end, this flawed reasoning, which is to say, there aren't any in the fields, so we don't study them. And so, since we put carbon in the fields, what happens? So, it's a topic that is still quite poorly studied. We find very few bibliographies on it, but we are starting to find some. So, I didn't conduct a small statistical study to see how much more it is being studied, but I had an intern work on it this year. We were quite surprised. We found several researchers who have started to do publications that basically show us that it is not negligible. That was already a good point, because 5 years ago we were told, no, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they don't exist, they are useless, it's a collective hallucination, they don't exist. And today I find researchers telling me that it is not negligible even in quite conventional systems. So we see that things are progressing, and we also realized, in fact, that what we call the ends of nitrogen were actually generating nitrogen fixation. And that, in my case, and probably in many agricultural systems, we will manage to achieve nitrogen autonomy, meaning that the era of NPK will somewhat come to an end, but it might not happen as easily as that. So, one of the observations that also led us to imagine that nitrogen autonomy was feasible on farms, even if we exported a bit of wheat, is simply that in the forest, you don't have legumes, so we don't have symbiotic nitrogen fixation as we presented to you yesterday. And yet it grows tremendously. It grows more and more. And so we generally have more nitrogen in forest systems as they develop, and it must come from somewhere. There you go. So that's a bit of the context. So an end of nitrogen. We'll quickly explain what an end of nitrogen is. So it's a thing. In fact, in nature, it's everywhere all the time. It's normal. It's just when we have organic matter with slightly high carbon nitrogen ratios, like straw, branches, leaves, that decompose, it actually always creates nitrogen ends. You have a small leaf that falls on the ground. Microorganisms start to attack it. It creates a nitrogen end. And we understood that probably most of the time in many conditions, every time I had a nitrogen end, I had nitrogen fixation. That was our basic working hypothesis. I haven't yet found studies that clearly disprove it, except that we use it intensively in the fields. We use this idea, and in fact we always end up with plenty of nitrogen. So it would deserve to be quantified a bit better, but it was the hypothesis we tried to validate. So basically, what is an end of nitrogen? In my soil, I have nitrogen available, so it's the residues you were showing us earlier that you wanted to try to absorb with BRF to prevent leaching. So I have nitrogen in my soil that is available at a given moment, and I will add BRF or straw, the organic matter with C/N ratios. I will integrate it into the soil immediately. What happens is that all my piece of fauna, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, yeast, etc., multiply enormously. And the problem is that these little creatures, they have a C to N ratio of 10. That is to say, in their overall composition, there is oxygen, this and that, but they need 10 carbon atoms and 1 nitrogen atom to form themselves. And my inputs of organic matter are much higher. They will have carbon. I have much, much more carbon. So my inputs, in fact, these are quite unbalanced diets for my soil fauna. They have a problem, which is that they have a lot of carbon, but not enough nitrogen. It's like if you eat only noodles all day long, at some point it can cause a little issue. And so this soil fauna has a lot of carbon, but it lacks nitrogen, so it indeed seeks to fix it in a biological form, and it will draw heavily on the soil stock. It will really pump very, very hard. And there, the plant, its main source of energy is still the foliage, whereas in front of it, there are microorganisms with several hundred tons of energy ready to consume, and so in fact they are much, much more powerful at retrieving nitrogen than the plant, which struggles with its small solar panels. In fact, we really have a soil ecosystem that is much more powerful with energy, and so it will draw all the nitrogen from the soil for itself. And the problem is that even by pumping everything there is in the soil, there is no longer enough, and so there it no longer has nitrogen. So it blocks its development, it blocks the development of the plant, and we get what is called a nitrogen deficiency. And so at that point, nothing grows anymore. So it's almost the same calculations you did earlier. It will give us orders of magnitude. If I put 100 tons of BRFR and then I count in tons, from the old school, 300 meters, that's it. It makes 300. Yes, you are rather at 400 meters. I have 50% carbon in it, in my BRF, which gives me 30 tons of carbon in my 60 tons of dry matter BRF pure, as it is shredded with a nitrogen content of 50. I actually have 600 units of nitrogen in my initial 100 tons of BRF. Once I have put my BRF into the soil, I have a coefficient of 50%, so half of my BRF turns into organic matter. Soils, as you were saying, I redo the calculations, and in the end, actually, when my BRF has transformed into organic matter in the soil, it contains 1.7 tons of nitrogen. So I have a small issue, which is that I had a product with 600 units of nitrogen, I put it in the soil, and half of it disappears. But actually its C to N ratio varies greatly. It is very rich in nitrogen. Here I have 50 carbons for 1 nitrogen, and now I have only 10 carbons for 1 nitrogen. So I basically have 5 times more nitrogen here in my material. Even if I lost some material, I still have 5 times more. And so in the end, I end up with 1700 units of nitrogen in my soil. And so suddenly, between the moment I applied my BRF and 18 months later, when it has decomposed, I have 1000 units of nitrogen that have appeared. These are the calculations we do, and that's why everyone was telling me. Because this can be calculated experimentally. We put down the mulch, come back 8 months later, measure how much is left, and say, well, 50% remains, so the K1 equals 50%. So that's measured experimentally, and experimentally we see that 1000 units of nitrogen are missing. And that's why everyone was telling me, if you try to enrich your soil with mulch, straw, or things like that, you're going to have this problem. And if you don't bring in those 1000 units of nitrogen, nothing will ever grow. It won't work. So since I'm stubborn, I didn't listen to anyone. I tried, then I waited, and then actually, after a while, not only did I have my 50% organic matter in the soil, I had my 30 tons of humus, I could see it in my soil analyses, but in addition, I indeed had my 1700 tons of nitrogen, and I also had 200 units of residue, and it was growing very, very well. So I didn't do the calculations, my soil measurements weren't absolutely precise, but roughly speaking, this magnitude of 50%, I found it respected in my soils, which clearly meant that I was missing 1000 units, and that I had 1000 units that had appeared in my system. So basically, my main hypothesis was that if I did this, in fact, I had gained 1000 units of nitrogen for free. And 1000 units of nitrogen, as you know, is worth about a good €1,000. And so, well, there you go. I started to find a method to get nitrogen really cheaply in industrial quantity. So here, in fact, I took pots in which I put washed sand at the bottom, and I just added mulches of different organic materials. And I planted cabbages in them. So this is grass, fresh grass, so it's a very low C/N ratio. It decomposes quickly, releases nitrogen quickly, and my cabbage grows. Here I only put crushed branches on the surface, so in fact my cabbage can only feed from the mulch because underneath it's washed sand. I only put crushed branches, the cabbage. It doesn't find nitrogen, it doesn't develop. And here I made a mix of half crushed branches, half grass, exactly the mixtures you suggest. Manure, crushed material, and my cabbage. It's doing well, so the tests are duplicated each time to ensure I don't have too many artifacts. Typically, a nitrogen deficiency, an organic matter that is more digestible for plants, and a balanced mix that allows the use of crushed branches without causing a nitrogen deficiency. It works very well. So there I had revisited some curves that I found very interesting. What I understood from it is that when I put mulch into the soil, I had strong development. Fungi, actinomycetes, bacterial flora. During this phase, I had all my biological activity developing. That's when it needed nitrogen, and then it subsided. My nitrogen deficiency subsided. From that moment on, the plant could start to find nitrogen in the soil again. What was surprising in these curves was that we found huge peaks of biological activity development in the following years, except that there was no nitrogen deficiency. And that, for me, was also one of the things that caught my attention. On your curves, we see a lot of biological activity development, but in the field, we don't observe a nitrogen deficiency. So if it was developing that much, and if it develops that much, without causing a nitrogen deficiency, at some point, it still has to find nitrogen somewhere. Yes, it's just the fungi, we agree. Everything else remains more or less. We have a small peak there, but anyway, the fungi are developing strongly. Unsure in terms of mass how much that represents, it's a little additional clue. Because nitrogen deficiency is minimal. We don't have nitrogen deficiency, it grows. We found, I have never seen a nitrogen deficiency with large tonnages. 100, 200 tons, 300 tons, 400 tons. I have done tests, I have colleagues who have done tests with much more. And we have never seen a nitrogen deficiency that lasted more than 5 months, actually. After a while, it rebalances and it lasts 5-6 months at most. And then, even if there is still a lot of biological activity, because as you were saying, it takes about 18 months for the BRF to decompose, so it's a biological activity, and particularly the fungi that decompose. Actually, at that point, we no longer had a complete nitrogen deficiency. So what I understood is that during this phase, it was in this phase that we had all this fixation of thousands of units of nitrogen, which lowered the C to N ratio of the organic matter, quite low, and then all the biological activities that came to complete the humification process, in fact, and recycle the nitrogen that had been fixed during that phase. It's very schematic, but overall, in the field, in terms of thumbs, that's still what I observed. I'll redo the diagram for you. Basically, we bring in a large quantity of shredded branches, which start to degrade and expand the pool of organic matter in the soil. This organic matter eventually becomes humified, and it creates a... Here we can't see at all. The drawing, actually, here, I have a new humus, I have a very large one. So we have an initial humus. We create a huge pool of humus. In the process, we have the biological activity of the soil that feeds on the organic matter, and which therefore develops enormously. And to actually develop, it takes the mineral nitrogen, because it has the M210 incestiol, it needs, the mineral nitrogen, actually the available nitrogen residues in the soil, and unfortunately the plant, it can no longer take mineral nitrogen, because the microorganisms draw much more strongly. And so our hypothesis was that, in fact, this flow, which in the diagrams, even in the diagrams found in publications, this flow exists, but it is always considered extremely weak. And in fact, our idea is to say, as we are going to put a lot of carbonaceous material into the soil, in fact, this flow will become significant. In fact, it will even become very important, since there is a lot to consume, and we will obtain a lot of nitrogen. Available for free. That's why our experiments were interesting. Regarding this issue, it's that if you put, I would say, a little bit of straw in the field, 10 tons, 20 tons, if you put a cover crop, if you add a few spoonfuls of something, or I don't know what, limited quantities, in fact, the system being very complex, you will always have difficulty measuring it if it is not really very intense. And so, when you put 500 tons of shredded branches, you can see it becomes intense. It represents thousands of units of nitrogen. The arrow on the left, which one? That one? Ah, you weren't saying there. It's actually free fixing. These are nitrogen fixing bacteria. So these are bacteria that allow you to gain atmospheric nitrogen. It draws nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so we think that if we put a lot of organic matter consistently and on it in the systems, this flow increases enormously. And so you have a lot of atmospheric nitrogen that is fixed. So nitrogen limitations, what factors influence them? The C to N ratio of organic matter. As soon as I go above 25, I have nitrogen limitations that become increasingly significant. As soon as I have a C to N ratio below 25, with thresholds at 8 and 14 I quickly pass, the nitrogen limitation is much weaker. That's why, if we want to avoid nitrogen limitations, we need to rebalance the ratios, mix a lower C to N with a higher C to N to achieve a balanced C to N ratio. And then we have very strong peaks of biological activity, which would rapidly decompose the organic matter without nitrogen limitations. I will move on. Poof, poof. This is the same experiment as earlier, but in a bit more detail, meaning that we actually have the same nitrogen limitation issues with straw. So this was interesting. It's straw that I let rot. And actually a straw, normally it has a CN ratio around 100. If you let it rot, its CN ratio, it drops to a level of 25. And then it's at 25 that the earthworm eats it. You know, it's all black, it's all rotten, it tears very, very easily, and it's at this stage. So this is the earthworm in its burrow that decomposes organic matter down to stage 25, and at stage 25 CN, it eats it. And that's where it's very good. So it's a mush of organic matter with fungi and bacteria. So if you take straw that you mix with water, a glass of water, your straw, the microorganisms, they will bring it down to a C to N ratio of 25. But for it to become stable organic matter down to a C to N ratio of about 10, the earthworm needs to eat it. Otherwise, it gets stuck at that level for a very long time. It will soon get there, but it will be very long. What's interesting in this experiment was straw with a C to N ratio of 25 that I used as mulch, whereas this one had a C to N ratio of 100. This one was almost already decomposed. And what this tells us is that the plant is not able to extract nitrogen from organic matter, and so there is a C to N ratio of 25 that is in the process of decomposing. We realize that organic matter, which is already half rotten, if it's strong and healthy organic matter, the nitrogen is not yet available for the plant. It takes the earthworm to finish the job. If, on the other hand, I add 4 earthworms to the pot, it will start to grow. I haven't tried it, but in the fields, that's what happens. So, with pure straw, it doesn't work. With grass, it works. With BRF, I have a nitrogen deficiency. And with mixtures, BRF, grass, it works. I don't have a nitrogen deficiency. So, there's also an issue with nitrogen deficiencies. People have said a bit of everything, regardless of common sense. Why? Because the symptom of nitrogen deficiency is a plant that's yellow and doesn't grow. And the thing is, there are many, many other factors that can cause a plant to be a bit yellowish and not grow. What is the most important factor that can cause a plant to be yellowish and not grow? Lack of water, but also too much water. Cold. No light or strong chemical imbalances in the soil. Poor rooting, soil compaction, for example, magnesium. Lack of iron. Lack of calcium. Not magnesium. We're not going to do the periodic table. You forget the most important cause of soil infertility that can lead to a plant. Don't have right t-shirt, but lack of earthworms. Well, yes, I'm telling you that if the earthworm finishes taking care of my straw, which has a C to N ratio of 25, it will in 2-3 ingestions bring it down to 10, and what will it do? It will secrete 600 units of nitrogen per ton of earthworms per hectare per year. One of the first problems you have when you add organic matter with a high C to N ratio in the fields is that it drops to a C to N ratio of 25. And then the earthworm has to take care of it to bring it down to a C to N ratio of 10, and then it starts secreting nitrogen. So in fact, if I go back to my curve, what happens? So which one is it? If I go back, this one, my nitrogen N lasts 6 months, except that here, my organic matter has dropped to a C to N ratio of about 25. And then it's the earthworm that takes over, and after 18 months it finishes bringing it down. Well, it's not alone, the fungi keep working, but it's really the earthworm that helps a lot. Especially if we are in no-till farming, meaning if we work the soil, the plow will help bring down a C to N ratio of 10. If we don't work the soil at all, it's the earthworm that will finish the job. And so, in fact, between the 6 months when the nitrogen N stops and 18 months, if I don't have enough earthworms, I don't have mineralization, no nitrogen. And so for 18 months, I have no nitrogen available, but there are clearly 2 extremely different phases. A first phase where I am at the end of hard nitrogen, and a second phase where the earthworms have to take over. So we really took a big hit with this thing, because for 18 months, absolutely nothing was growing, and everyone was telling us, we warned you, BRF, it kills the soil, it kills the soil, it kills the soil. In fact, it was banned. I don't know what, we heard all the nonsense in the world. And actually, you have to understand that the nitrogen depletion lasted 6 months and the earthworms will take 18 months to come back. So in fact, what was very strange is that we put large volumes of BRF into the soil, somewhat against common sense. It didn't grow for 18 months. After 18 months, it started to grow like crazy. But then we couldn't take it anymore. That's exactly what happened under my apple trees. After 2 years, it started to grow like crazy. And there we didn't understand anything. Why after 18 months does everything start to grow? Well, actually, in the end, we unraveled the case. 6 months nitrogen depletion, 18 months to develop earthworm population, and we found fertile soil. And by the way, we might have gained a few thousand units of nitrogen. It would be interesting to measure them. So I did some small tests to see this enrichment in straw, this nitrogen enrichment of organic matter over time and on nitrogen. These are things I did with the resources at hand. I think I was quite precise, but it would still deserve a good thesis to delve deeper with all the organic materials, etc. These are very, very simple tests that could clearly allow us to quantify the amounts of nitrogen we can obtain by using shredded materials, straw, leaves, and this kind of organic matter over time and on nitrogen. So basically, I take fresh straw with a C/N ratio of 160. No, actually, I had quite low C/N ratios, so I conducted a test on wood chips and straw with a C/N ratio of 65, C/N of 60. It was small wood chips and straw that had already been exposed to water once in the field. There is a certain percentage of nitrogen, a bit of water in it, dry matter, etc. I let it compost cold in pots so that they all turn black like this. So as I was saying, this is the straw that the earthworm likes to eat. This is what it eats. It's at this stage, and so I go from a C/N ratio of 60 to a C/N ratio of 30 for the wood chip, a C/N ratio of 65 to a C/N ratio of 26 for the straw. So here I illustrated it with the straw. I accurately measure my total nitrogen by drying the materials and sending them to the lab, etc. And I realized that actually, Domo. In my transition from a C/N ratio of 60 to 30, for straw, I had a 113% of the initial nitrogen, gained 13% nitrogen, and for BRF, I gained 30%. Knowing that, I just went from a C/N ratio of 60, meaning a BRF that wasn't very carbon rich to begin with, to a C/N ratio of 30, where normally the earthworm takes over C to N around 25-30. And if the earthworm had continued its work, probably my percentage should be a little higher still. So in the end, if we extrapolate and really take BRF around 100 and straw at 100 and we go down to 10, basically we should almost double the amount of nitrogen of initial nitrogen. So I will put straw with 5 units of nitrogen. In the end, when my straw has decomposed, I should have 10, and approximately the same for the earthworms. Roughly speaking, we double the initial nitrogen when we add organic matter intensively and on N in the soils.